Hello everybody, I'm Z-Faction. Thank you for tuning into my channel, as it's been a very long time since I've last uploaded a video on this channel. And other than that, I've also deleted my other videos, as I'm still trying to understand what it is I would like to do with this channel in the near future. But in the meantime, I'm just going to be making this video in what I would consider a slight collab with Creole Lady Marmalade. I'll put her link in the description below. Those of y'all who are interested more in Louisiana Creole and Cajun culture and identity, I recommend y'all hit her channel up. And it was also, she agreed to me making this video. We'd like to reference each other as well. But yeah, so basically what I really want to discuss in this video is the nature of Latin American identity, as well as where there seems to be issues regarding Latin identity groups, and not just amongst each other, but also amongst other non-Latin groups in the Americas, such as the Anglo-American world or the Dutch American world. But yeah, so there's a multiplicity of things I'd like to bring up. Before I get started too much, I would like to first give an explanation of my own personal identity and how I've been navigating it throughout my life. And although it's still in flux, I do have usually a basic core foundation that I do identify with, and that identity is specifically Anglo-Hispanic. So what does it mean to be Anglo-Hispanic? In my definition, it means to descend from both the Anglo-American peoples, or British America, and the Spanish American peoples, or Hispanic America, Spanish America generally. So from my dad's side, he's a Criollo from Nicaragua. He grew up in Miami in the 80s. I was born and raised in Florida, which is one of the country's most diverse states, and has a heavy Latin influence, especially from the Spanish Caribbean. But other than that, so him being a Criollo from Nicaragua, specifically Managua, the capital, means that he is a Nicaraguan of primarily Spanish and European overall ancestry, making him what you could call a Euro Latino or white Latino. My mother's side, though, her background is a little bit more complex. She was adopted by a Anglo family with a Yankee mom from Massachusetts and a Southern dad who was born and raised in Orlando at the time when it was still primarily Southern. She's originally from Texas, though, and really descends from four nations. My apologies, three nations. Those three nations being Greater Appalachia, as I like to call it, which is the Highland South. You know, that's like Tennessee, Kentucky, even North Texas, that whole area, West Virginia. That's Appalachia. It's primarily a area that was settled by people of Scotch-Irish ancestry and has its own unique identity. She also descends from the Midland areas, or the Midlands, which is another nation. And when I'm referring to nations in this video, I'm referring to the nations that are described in Colin Woodard's book, American Nations, which I would recommend you all read for those of you all who want a better understanding of overall Anglo-America. As well, it also explains other parts of the overall North American continent as well. They're not Anglo inherently. But yes, so that's Appalachia, or Greater Appalachia, as he references it in the book, is one of those nations. The Midlands is another one. The Midlands was primarily established by Quakers and was more of the melting pots of North America, or overall British America. And because of that, that's why many people in the Midlands, and a good example of Midland states are Iowa. Iowa's a Midland state. You could say the central part of Ohio, Indiana, so on and so forth. It's really the region that splits the South, specifically the Appalachian Highland South, from the North, or the Yankee North, New England, and Greater New England area. They're more politically moderate, and yeah, so many Germans migrated to that settlement area, especially the Amish and the Mennonites. Also, Scotch-Irish people as well, and really in general, people from all over Britain, and later down the line, also other parts of Europe, and now even other non-European sources of origin. But other than that, so yeah, the Midlands is another one of the nations I descend from my mom's side, and it is an inherently Anglo nation. And the other nation that I descend from my mother's side is what Colin Wood references as El Norte, which is basically the American Southwest and North Mexico. I prefer to label it Aztlán, as many people in the Chicano movement would refer to it as, because Aztlán, I believe, is a more all-encompassing name that really distinguishes this region, and also applies to the history not just of the Chicano movement, but of even the people who existed there prior to the Mexican and American border. But other than that, so basically to summarize it all up, I descend from two Hispanic nations and two Anglo nations. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to try to keep this video focused on Latin America and the concept of Latin American identity. So when it comes to Latin American identity or Latin American values, I actually would define Latin America into four regions, specifically the Latin Caribbean, which I include to be not just the Spanish Caribbean, so like Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, but also the French Caribbean, such as Haiti, and also the French colonies in the Lesser Antilles and in French Guyana. I would also include Louisiana's southern region, which is called Acadiana, which has where the Louisiana Creole and Cajun population are primarily centered around, as I believe they have a similar climate, similar culture, similar phenotypes, and so on and so forth to the rest of the Latin Caribbean. I also would include most of Brazil, not all of Brazil, but most of Brazil, as well as Panama, and to a degree possibly Costa Rica, but I'll get into that further. Another good example of the Latin Caribbean would be the Miami metro area, where my father grew up. So if one has been to Florida, y'all know that we're very different in different parts of the state. We have four primary major metro areas that have over 1 million people, and soon more to come. But those major metro areas by population from highest to lowest are as follows: Miami, Metro Miami, which is where we have a heavy Cuban and other Latin American influences, and you can call Miami the metropole or mother city, not just of the Spanish Caribbean, but of Latin America in general. It is literally the hub of Latin American culture, industry, and finance. Most of Latin families and Latin American communities have many links to the greater Miami area. The second largest metro area in Florida is Tampa, Metro Tampa. Tampa, I would say, is the more OG original Florida city, as it has a bit of that Spanish Caribbean aspect, but also has a bit of that Southern influence, which includes both the white and black population, and has also some of that Yankee Midland influence as well. And I consider it really the real Florida city. It doesn't really have an identity that you could separate it from Florida. It really is a part of Florida. Then following after Tampa is Orlando, Metro Orlando. Now, for those of y'all who go to Orlando, we know that there's a lot of theme parks there. I was born in the greater Orlando area personally, and I grew up there for the first half of my childhood. So yeah, growing up in Orlando, it's called the theme park capital of the world for a very good reason. You have Disney, you have Universal Studios, you have all kinds of theme parks there, and more on the rise. And you're not too far from Cape Canaveral, the Space Coast as well. It's also a much more distinctly, I would say, corporate city. To me, I personally do not see Orlando as having a base culture that's based in a certain people group, but more so off of commercial endeavors. Primarily, that was started by Disney. But anyways, and then we have finally, last but not least, is Jacksonville, Metro Jacksonville. Jacksonville very clearly is a southern city, and even if you go to the Gullah Coast, or no, the Jacksonville Coast, you have the Gullah people who are actually have more in common with the Anglo-Caribbean. They even speak a dialect of Creole. But other than that, they're still a minority in a broadly very southern city. So when you look at Florida, you can really split Florida into three, possibly even four regions. The other metro area that I believe is soon on the rise would be the greater Cape Coral metro area. Lee County alone, which is located in Southwest Florida, it has more people in it than all of North Dakota. It has over 700 something thousand people. Once they hit 1 million, then it's already a major metro area. Although I do consider Charlotte County and Collier County as part of that broader Cape Coral area, and therefore that would already make them have a population of over 1 million people. But in that environment, I call it the Yankee Caribbean, as it's primarily settled by Yankee Northerners. Most people here are retirees, which is where I'm at now. I'm specifically in Punta Gorda. It's a much more of a tourism town, but we do have also a very fast growing Latin minority. If you go to Collier County alone, about 30% of their population is Latino, primarily Cuban and Mexican ancestry. And Lee County is about 20% Latino. Charlotte County is very white, about 84%, and still growing. But other than that, they're further starting to integrate, and I wouldn't be surprised if they become a fifth major metro area that make Florida distinct in its own way for that region. But anyways, going back to it, so when it comes to these identities, and another reason why I bring up Florida is because my own personal identity has been really molded by this immense diversity that I was exposed to of identities and cities in the megalopolis, that megalopolis or mega region being Florida. But yeah, so going back originally to the main focal point of this video, which is Latin American identity and its relation to Anglo-American identities, is as follows. First off, there's a big divide between what defines a Latino person in comparison to an Anglo person, and people always have their stereotypes of the other. Good example is this. When most people who are not Latin think of Latinos or Latin Americans in general. They might think, oh, they're very vibrant, they're hot-blooded, they're promiscuous, they're spicy, and yeah, you can say there's some truth to that. I won't deny that. But the problem with obviously with stereotypes that although there may be some truth to them, they overgeneralize the population and can actually truly misinform people about our identity and our culture. Same applies to Anglos. Most people think that all white people in America are the same. They're not. They are not. I cannot tell you how many people, Anglo Americans, descend from the Germans, the Poles, so on and so forth. Heck, I believe that German Americans are actually the largest white ethnic group in the United States. And they don't come from Anglo origins, they come from Teutonic origins. They come from Germany, not the British Isles. They just happened to adopt British or Anglo customs when they came and migrated here to the United States. But yes, so some issues that happen for Latinos, especially in the broader Anglosphere. And when I mean the Anglosphere, that includes not just the United States, but also Canada, specifically Anglo-Canada, the British Isles, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, is that when it comes to concepts such as race is not very fluid. Race is very, very rigid in the Anglosphere, and I'm pretty sure many of my fellow Latinos out there, whether you descend from the Spanish Caribbean, or no, my apologies, whether you descend from Spanish America, Lusic Portuguese America, French America, that you could relate. You understand where I'm coming from. I can't tell you how many of my Latino friends who are mixed race, primarily like mulatto or mestizo. Mulatto meaning being half black, half white, and mestizo half white, half indigenous, how they're constantly racialized and considered others or not included in one group or the other. A big problem in America is that the Anglo, specifically the United States, is that the Anglo model of identity was based more off of race, whereas I would say in Latin America broadly, it was based off more of class. And but now, do not get me wrong. Whiteness is associated with the upper classes in Latin America, and racism is very prevalent in Latin America, but it is not as binary when identifying people as it is in the Anglosphere, and primarily you could say North America. So yeah, so there's many things that we have to take into account regarding this. Now going back to me defining Latin America into 4 regions, the reason why I do that is because I believe it's an easier way to explain to Latin and non-Latin viewers alike who are curious about the nature of Latin American identity or the differences and diversity within Latin American culture. And so they can have a better, grander understanding of it. And most of this information I'm providing for you has come from countless works I've studied or I've looked into. I myself am a student of social psychology and political science through Southern New Hampshire University. But other than that, there's this primary central focus that I have on trying to understand the nature of identity, because growing up myself, I did struggle with a split identity. I had serious cultural dysphoria, as I call it. I mean, I didn't really feel like I belonged to either of the Anglo or Hispanic populations. I kind of felt alienated and separated from both. And it's actually only been until recently, and let you know, I'm going to be 24 on the 10th of April, and I'm still now struggling to overcome that division in that binary. And getting back to cultural dysphoria, it is a very, very real thing that many people experience, especially on the border regions between Latin America or Spanish America, even in Anglo America. And even in South Louisiana, Quebec as well, although the Quebecois, they always like to market their identity strongly. We're not those Anglos. So maybe that they're not they don't struggle as much with identity. Now the Louisiana Creoles and Cajuns, they do sometimes. They're always pushed to that binary, and the reason why I think that's the case is because they border the Deep South, and the Deep South we already know has a deep ingrained issues with racism, slavery, black-white biracialism, and you could say borderline race war. And a lot of the Louisiana Creoles, some Louisiana Creoles are black and some are white, but also a lot of them are mixed. And it doesn't help when you're a mixed person who happens to descend from both European and African ancestry, and people, especially Anglos, who have no links to French America or to pre-Anglo Louisiana, who are being pushed into one identity or another, and it could really be stressful, most certainly. But to those of y'all who are struggling with such cultural dysphoria, who descend from these diverse American regions, whether it be Spanish, French, British, or Portuguese America or Dutch America, I do believe that that we can make ourselves kind of, you can say the what's the word I'm looking for, the the translators, the cultural translators of some sort, the emissaries for harmony between the groups, the true Pan-American children, the children of the Americas, because we all do descend from these settler colonies, whether we're Anglo or Latin, it doesn't matter. We descend from the byproduct of European colonization, African enslavement, and Native American populations. That's what makes us who we are. But yeah, so Latin America is 4 regions. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to describe them by zone, in the sense that I'm going to describe the countries I believe are included or should be included in that specific region of Latin America, what I see as their foundations and what led to their foundational creations, and their racial, religious, and political histories, so on and so forth. I'll probably actually gloss over the political more, since this is not necessarily history. This is more about identity, although history does define identity to a degree. But that's a whole other video. Yeah, so first, to start off with, let's go back to the Latin Caribbean. So as I said, the Latin Caribbean, in my opinion, includes the Spanish Caribbean, which includes Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. It also includes what I see as the French Caribbean, French Guyana, or what actually is the French Caribbean, as well as the French East Antilles. Most of them are still French Guyana. Most of the French East Antilles are still territories or part of France. But a lot of them have the phenotype and similar history to the rest of the Americas. Also, I would include most of Brazil, with the exception of Brazil's South region, which includes Brazil's states of Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul. And I'll explain that later. So to describe this region, the Latin Caribbean, which I also include Colombia, Venezuela, North Ecuador, and Panama. Some of the core foundations that I would define this region as are as follows. I first off would consider the Latin Caribbean the most multiracial of all Latin American regions. They are primarily triracial, meaning descending from 3 races, those being European colonizers and settlers, African slaves, as well as native populations. So what happened is that the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were united under their common Latin identity, and also FYI, the term Latin America actually came from the French. That did not come from the Spanish or the Portuguese. It was the French who called Latin America. And they have a sense of what they call Latin identity, which they believe is shared amongst all Latin peoples. The Quebecois call it Latinite, whereas most Hispanics will call it Latinidad. There's a certain Latinness that defines our people. That's usually based our links to the old world Latin powers. But yeah, so other things that define the Latin Caribbean, other than its triracialism, is also the nature of the colonies. Most of the colonies that were in the West Indies were slave colonies or extraction colonies. A lot of it revolved around sugarcane especially Haiti, and Haiti was completely was literally one big slave colony. Why it's so African in descent today, but also it's tropical in climate. You could say though that although Acadiana and Metro New Orleans, although they're part of the Latin Caribbean, they have a subtropical climate, but honestly it's close enough. They have a swampy climate, very similar to Florida's, and obviously although Southeast Florida, specifically Metro Miami, is tropical, it still is right on that border region with other subtropical environments. So I don't really see that as a big deal. But yes, so triracial and tropical. When most people think of Latin music like merengue, bachata, samba, bossa nova, or reggaeton, most of it comes out of this part of Latin America, the Latin Caribbean, especially the Spanish Caribbean and Brazil. And I personally would link that music ability to the African side of the region. And forgive me for saying we, as I do not descend from the Latin Caribbean per se, but since I was raised around Latin Caribbeaners in my upbringing, and it's I was more Latinized through the Latin Caribbean. I do consider myself at least somewhat culturally linked to the Latin Caribbean, despite descending from Nicaraguans and North Mexicans. But yeah, so a lot of that vibrancy that was associated with the Latin Caribbean is rooted in that African origin. Heck, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, especially West Africa, where a lot of the descendants of the Americas came from, also they came from like Congo, Angola, so on and so forth. They're very vibrant cultures. very high energy cultures, and it doesn't surprise me that that was transplanted across the Atlantic into the Americas. When it comes to religion, just like the rest of Latin America and the rest of the Latin world in general, which also includes Latin Africa, Latin Asia, and also, of course, Latin Europe, with the exception of Romania, which is the only Orthodox Christian country that is Latin in the entire world, which is interesting. Uh, there is kind of a mixture of Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, specifically of the Iberian and you could say the Franco-Iberian model, and traditional African and indigenous beliefs. Hence why we see traditions like Santeria, Candomblé, as well as Voodoo, or just Voodoo. Like a lot of these traditions, or Umbanda, they are a mixture of Catholicism and African or indigenous spirituality. One of the reasons why I also consider Acadiana as part of this broader Latin Caribbean region is because although the Cajuns they descend from the Acadians who were they were exiled from Acadia, which is right next to it's current day New Brunswick and Nova Scotia around Quebec. When they ended up coming across Louisiana Creoles who were also already racially mixed. Just like the rest of the Latin Caribbean. So they do have a similar history, similar traditions, hence why there's still a lot of African-infused traditions in traditional Southern Louisiana spirituality. And they do have a lot more in common with the Latin Caribbean than you could say the African-American population, who are rooted in a much more Anglo identity, and especially more than the white Anglos, who have also a different tradition and history than they do. But other than that, yeah, it's also a region that's primarily sea-based or thalassocratic, as they say. So it's a sea-based, a thalassocracy basically means a sea-based region, or you could say even empire. But yeah, primarily revolve around trade, especially in the trade of goods, especially sugar. And New Orleans, all the South Louisiana is off the Gulf of Mexico and not too far from the Caribbean. But yeah, so that's how I would describe the Latin Caribbean as its own separate identity. And many of you Louisiana Creoles out there in Cajuns I don't see why you would not fit into such an identity. I see y'all as actually an extension as part of our broader Latin family. And I believe y'all have a very similar history to, let's say, us Hispanic or Spanish Americans as well. And even some of y'all have some Anglo influences such as myself. And these are very real things we experienced since Acadiana and South Louisiana is on a buffer region between Latin America and Anglo America. But yeah, so this whole area, like I said, it goes Colombia, Venezuela, Panama as well. There's that triracialism, that folk Catholicism, as it's called, which is a mixture of traditional Catholicism with folk beliefs of non-Christian or non-Catholic origin. Based around all these, this tropical climate, so on and so forth. The next region I would describe as its own region is what I would say call Neo-Mesoamerica or Greater Mesoamerica. So Greater Mesoamerica, when I refer to Greater Mesoamerica, I'm referring to the whole American Southwest. So that includes like states like California, Texas, at least West Texas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, all the way down to West Nicaragua. So now that region, unlike the Latin Caribbean, which is primarily triracial and sea-based, this region was primarily mestizo, biracial, meaning primarily of European and indigenous ancestry. Not that they're not Afro-Latinos who exist in the region, they most certainly do. They're just a much larger minority. Oh no, my apologies. They're much more of a minority than they are obviously in Latin Caribbean, where they are a majority for the most part. It's really a byproduct of the mixture of Iberic civilization, especially the Spanish variety, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilizations. So whereas when the Spanish, Portuguese, and French, when they arrived in the broader Latin Caribbean area, or the Caribbean, what became the Caribbean, they met native tribes, the Arawak peoples, who primarily were hunter-gatherers and did not really have as complex civilizational models. There really wasn't any civilization in stark contrast to their Franco-Iberian Catholic model. Hence, keeping the foundational culture primarily Latin and Catholic. And even with the African population, although there were African peoples who descended from powerful kingdoms and empires in Africa, whether it be Songhai or even Mali when it was around, and the Yoruba kingdoms, because they were sold into slavery, a lot of them, they were stripped of that civilizational identity and were kind of put in this tribalistic format as well. But that wasn't the case in Greater Mesoamerica, where the Spanish had a civilization in stark contrast to the pre-Columbian Aztec, Olmec, Maya, Toltec peoples, etc. The thing that really defines this region, I would say, is that it's the region that most people think of when they think of Latin America in the United States, maybe with the exception of parts of the Southeast because the Caribbean. But yeah, you could tell that most people they really just see when they Anglos specifically when they see Latin America they see Mexico, but it's not just Mexico, as we all know. But yes, so going back to it, this region, just like the Latin Caribbean, also has a type of folk Catholicism that they abide by, primarily a Catholicism that mixes traditional Catholicism with traditional Mesoamerican spirituality. We see that in movements such as the Cult of Santa Muerte, which has actually been on the rise, especially amongst the Chicano community and the North Mexican community, the Aztlan area, as I call it, and also Tzotzil religion, and not to mention the countless folk traditions that are brought by the Maya peoples that are still around today, by the way. Or Guatemala, they're Maya everywhere. And there's still that infusion, like even the Dia de los Muertos goes back to pre-Columbian Mesoamerican traditions. It does not have its root in Western traditions. They just Catholicized it a bit, you can say. But yeah, so this region I would say is primarily biracial and bi-civilizational. The climate is slightly more diverse. It really stretches from the Sierra Madre all the way down to I would say the jungles of Central America, and also the Great Basin, the Sonora Desert, all those areas. So it's really a mixture. It's really a dry. It comes from dry to wet, but also it's primarily land based because so tellerocracy. Tellerocracy is more of a land based empire, a land based society, because most of Mexico and even into Central America is on a big plateau. So although they are surrounded by water on two sides, they have the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Caribbean Sea to the east. Because there's such high altitude in the majority of the nation, most of the cities are located in this higher elevated areas, and therefore it's more land based, not as much sea based. But yes, so that's how I would describe the overall Greater Mesoamerican region. And moving on to the next region of Latin America, I would refer to it as the Andinic world or the Greater Andes. So this would include South Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and North Chile to a degree. So this area, before the arrival of the Spanish under Francisco Pizarro, was under the domain of the Inca Empire. Now, although the Inca, just like the Aztec and so on and so forth, were an indigenous civilization, to consider them the same is like saying that the Orthodox Slavic Russians are the same as the Latin Catholic Italians. But whereas they're from two different civilizations, Atlantic or Western civilization, I prefer to call it Atlantic civilization, and Orthodox civilization. A Russian and the Italian are not the same. They might both be white and European, but yeah, there's a big difference between a Slav and a Latin, just like there's a big difference between an Andean and a Mesoamerican. But other than that, so when the Spanish arrived under Francisco Pizarro on the shores of what was at the time the Inca Empire, or as the natives call it, Tawantinsuyu. I forgot what it means. There's a proper definition of what it means. I don't remember it at the moment. The thing is that although the Spanish did arrive in this area and they did conquer it, just like Cortez did to Mesoamerica, I personally do not believe that they were as successful in colonizing the region as they were in other parts of Latin America. Primary reason: Bolivia has the largest indigenous population in all of the Americas. It also, overall, the greater Andean area is still majority indigenous. You have mestizos too. In some areas, it's more half mestizo, half indigenous. But other than that, indigenous people are still really the dominant group, specifically the indigenous Andean people, like the Quechua or Aymara people. So the thing about that is there's some debates as to why that is. My personal reasoning why I think that's the case is probably not the only reason. But so the Andes was a much higher altitude due to it being a mountainous terrain, which is another thing. The climate's very different. It's a mountainous climate primarily, with an ocean to the west and the Amazon to the east. The thing about this area is that actually the native Andean peoples had lungs evolved for high altitude environments that the Europeans and African slaves did not have, because they came from different climates and environments. So I partially think that could have probably stunted Spanish colonization of the area, because if you don't have the lungs designed for the area, but they do, who do you think is going to surpass you in those environments? The population that has the lungs adapted to that environment, correct? So yeah, When it comes to describing the region, I would say that it is, although it is still, it has a good, a sizable mestizo population, I would say that its base culture is Andean native or indigenous first. Whereas the Latin Caribbean is triracial and descends from one civilization, that primarily being the Franco-Iberian Catholic version of Atlantic Western civilization, and whereas Greater Mesoamerica descends from two civilizations, primarily again the Iberic, specifically the Iberic Spanish Catholic Western model of civilization, and the pre-Columbian Mesoamerican peoples, such as again the Maya, Aztec, Toltec, Zapotec, Tarascans, so on and so forth. They are bi-civilizational and they're biracial. So you could say the Latin Caribbean is triracial but monocivilizational, whereas Greater Mesoamerica is biracial, bi-civilizational. I would consider this region primarily monoracial and monocivilizational. Now, the reason why I say that is because, yes, it's still the ruling class of these countries, of Peru, Bolivia, so on and so forth, of the Andean areas, are still criollos, which is where my family descends from. And criollo, by the way, is Spanish for Creole, and actually referred to Europeans who were born in the Americas. Specifically, my ancestors who were Spaniards. Well, they weren't from the peninsula, so they weren't peninsulares, but they were born in the Americas and of primarily of almost entirely Spanish or broader European descent. So yeah. The Criollos are still the ruling class, and there's still a huge power dynamic between class and race. And indigeneity or indigenousness, for lack of a better word, is still associated with being lower class or inferior, and that's very unfortunate. It really hurts me because I think we as Latin Americans should do more to actually take pride in our identities and stop trying to exploit each other horrendously. The same is true in other parts of the rest of Latin America. Criollos still are primarily the ruling class, whether it's in Mexico or the Dominican Republic or even Peru, so on and so forth. But yeah, but the reason why I say it's monocivilizational or monoracial because I do believe it's going to be reclaimed by the indigenous Andean peoples as they do have higher birth rates. There's also been a rise of movements that are defending indigenous identity, and do keep in mind they are the majority as well in this vast area, and they do come from a rich tradition. But whereas in the Latin Caribbean, it was Atlantic civilization that made itself the dominant culture and made it monocivilizational in that format. In the Andes, it will be the Andinic Inca, you could say broader Inca, or just say Andinic, which refers to Andean version of civilization reclaiming the area. And I believe that the Spanish influence would be considered more so of a secondary identity or in the long run over time. We must remember that Latin American identities are still very young. We only have a few hundred years of identity development, and we're still developing it now. And hence why we saw these issues of debate about race, class, nationality, so on and so forth, religion within not just Latin America, but the Americas in general. Whereas the old world, such as in Europe and Asia, Africa, they have thousands of years of history. So it's going to take time. And yeah, we must remember Latin America was basically under colonialism for half a millennia, and it's only been independent for a little over a century and a half maybe. So yeah, there's still a lot that we got to work through. But yeah, so I believe in the long run that there's going to be a reclamation of the broader Andean region by its indigenous population. Another thing that we see in this area is that in the cities, that's where you find most of the mestizo peoples who are half European, half indigenous, and where also the criollos primarily live. But in the countryside, it's primarily indigenous. It's really only indigenous. Some of them don't even have Spanish as their first language. Most of them don't. And the same applies to even greater Mesoamerica. The cities are where there's more of the mestizos and criollos, where the countryside is more indigenous. And some of them still have a tribal language, a native indigenous Mesoamerican language as their first language before Spanish as well. But yeah, so that's my perspective on the greater Andean world or the Andinic civilization. And yeah, you can even see with rises and movements such as the Neo-Andeanism, which is actually a form of architecture that's been on the rise. Even Evo Morales, he was the first Bolivian president of indigenous descent. And he actually would wear traditional and Andean clothing, and also he was always a strong proponent for his people. And he was recently ousted in a coup by, I guess, who the criollos, but he was very well respected. And I think he ruled throughout from the early 2000s, or no, early mid 2000s till the late 2010s or early 2020s. I could be getting it wrong, but yeah, he ruled for a long time, about 20 years possibly. But yes, so that's the Andean world. Last but not least is what I see as really the most Latin of them all of Latin America, the most European and the most white overall, and that is southern South America and also Quebec. So the thing about these regions, so what I mean, what countries am I referring to in southern South America? Well, I'm referring to Brazil South region, so Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, Paranas, as well as the countries of Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, primarily. And the thing about this region, as well as Quebec, is that they're a majority European. They identify primarily as European, and they actually have a climate similar to that of Europe. It's temperate or continental. Quebec is the same way. So they have a similar climate, a similar culture, and they were actually settler colonies, especially Argentina. You can say Argentina has a lot more in common with America with settlement patterns than it does with even other parts of Latin America, as many Irish, Italians, and Germans went to Argentina just like they did coming to the United States. But yeah, so the thing about this region is that even if you go to Argentina, they say that when they speak Spanish, it's like speaking Spanish with an Italian accent. Many people who I've come across, they said that when they would go to southern South America, especially countries like Argentina and Uruguay, they would feel like that they were in Latin Europe, that they feel like they were in Italy or Spain, because the culture and the demographic and the phenotype is so similar. Heck, even in Patagonia and parts of South Brazil, there's many Polish people and Irish people who and German people who still speak their languages, their native languages, or their ancestral languages, as we should call it, right? But yeah, so they're really the most European, and that's why I say they're the most Latin of them all, because they don't really have as much African or indigenous influence. And again, does not mean that they're not Afro-Latinos or indigenous Latinos who come from those countries. They most certainly are. They're just much smaller as a population than the vast European or Europeanized group. And the largest secondary group to the white population is the Castizo population. Castizo is basically someone who's comes from a mestizo parent and a white parent. I technically would be considered a castizo. Castizos are at least 75% European and usually about 25% indigenous. But I honestly just consider that broadly more European because it's majority European. You're 3/4 European. You're primarily white. People like me would look Italian. We don't look like even our more mestizo cousins or family members. I don't look mulatto either, although I got family members who are mulatto. I got many family members who are mestizo. But yeah. So yeah, the region primarily follows the traditional Catholicism, and a lot of them actually resemble European society. There's also influence in secularism, especially in Quebec, where you're not even allowed to wear religious symbolism in public, just like they do in France. And again, the climate is similar, temperate and continental. And it fits in perfectly with Europe's climatic model, I guess you can say, and bioregion overall. Another thing too is that all of these countries are actually, although South Brazil is not a country, if it were, it would be considered part of this. They're all first world, so that means that they're first world, just like Europe and just like the United States and Canada. Quebec is first world, Uruguay is first world, Argentina's first world, although they've had a lot of recessions, but yeah, they're first world. Another thing though too is that even South Brazil, I forgot what city it was, but there's a city in South Brazil that they said was the most, that had the highest score on HDI in all of Latin America. It was on European levels. So yeah, that basically can provide more of an image of how similar it is to Europe. So yeah, these are all things that we should look into, not just as Latinos, but also as non-Latino peoples. And I think it's a better way for those of us who are also born in the New World, specifically the Americas, to get a better understanding of our broader Pan-American family, whether they be Anglo, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, etc. But yeah, so overall, this was basically my explanation of Latin America's 4 regions, as well as overall identity for shortly from my own perspective, and as well as my interpretations through study. I might do a video in the future if y'all want that describes the cultural foundations of a lot of these Latin American countries off of a social psychologist Dr. Geert Hofstede's country comparison tool, which is a good way. So basically, to best describe it, Dr. Geert Hofstede, he's a Dutch social psychologist. May he rest in peace. He did pass away a few years ago. His research crew would actually go to countries and analyze them on certain cultural dimensions. There were 6 dimensions that they were measured upon. Those dimensions were power distance, which would measure how equal or unequal a country was; individualism or collectivism, so how individualist or collectivist a culture is; uncertainty avoidance, so whether a culture is more open to uncertainty or more avoidant of it; as well as indulgence and restraint. So is the society more indulgent and pleasure-seeking, leisure-focused, or is it more restraint, so more disciplined, more work ethic focused? Also, what's the other one? Also, it'll come back to me. Oh yeah, short-term or long-term oriented. So, or the terms I prefer to use, monumentalist and flexible. So, do the cultures define themselves more in the long term? Are they more adaptable? Or are they more focused on maintaining their identity, preserving and focusing more on tradition? And also in the, masculinity or femininity. That usually compares countries on how traditionally feminine or masculine they behave as a culture. Is they change the terminology to motivation towards success and consensus instead, due to, I believe, political correctness reasons. But I'm just going to stick to if I'm to do the video, I'll stick to the masculine feminine dynamic, as it's the one I'm more familiar with and have a better understanding of overall. But yeah, so I can do a video on that if y'all want. I can also do a video on bicultural peoples, especially those who descend from Anglo and Latin identities within the broader United States and the Americas in general, as I would like to be a voice to my fellow bicultural brothers and sisters out there who do feel the struggle. And yeah, hopefully I can be a guide in that as well. But other than that, yeah, so this has been Z Faction. Maybe you'll hear from me again very soon. Maybe not. We shall see. Depends on the direction that this channel goes. But other than that, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy. Bye.